Hello everyone, and welcome to your updated ZHONGLI guide. ZHONGLI has been my favorite character ever since I started playing, and as a top 1000 ZHONGLI, I really should not be saying that. This video is to hopefully guide any current or future ZHONGLI owners on how to roughly build and play him. While not much has changed with ZHONGLI, I figured I should update my old 3.0 guide since that's pretty old and I want to give more detail in lieu of his current rerun. This video will cover all of the following in order: general playstyles, talent overview, weapon options, artifact sets and stats, team comps, Constellation Overview, and an Abyss 12 showcase with multiple teams, all in an as condensed manner as possible, with timestamps below for you to navigate to wherever you want. Just to also clarify, my own ZHONGLI is at C6, but most of the footage recorded is when I had him at C2, as well as additional footage from my free-to-play account C0 ZHONGLI and my friend's C4 ZHONGLI that I used to record Hu Tao footage with. In any case, his general builds and roles are the same, so it shouldn't really matter too much other than his damage. If you need a point of reference, all of my personal builds are on my Anchor profile in the description. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into the guide. ZHONGLI's primary role is a shield support that negates most teams from needing a healer. He has the strongest shield in the game with the longest uptime, and being Ji-Eun, this allows him to fit into many teams that don't mind having a neutral defensive slot. Having him as a shielder also frees up certain characters for your other side of the Abyss, which can be very helpful, especially for those who have not yet been able to obtain certain characters or invested in them yet. However, ZHONGLI's shield isn't just for the sole purpose of negating the need for a healer. This shield is also a source of super armor, as you cannot take knockback or get staggered when you have it on. This is essential for certain characters who can get their DPS heavily affected when staggered, some notable examples of which are Wanderer, Tignari, Yoimiya, and Ganyu. Additionally, a character like Hu Tao really likes having ZHONGLI, as his shield prevents her from dying when she plays at a low HP, while also providing her the super armor so she can freely spam her charge attacks. Despite all this though, ZHONGLI is rarely the best option for damage in teams that you can slot him in. He is for the most part a comfort character, allowing you to play him without the need to dodge as much. And there are usually much better characters that will offer more damage than ZHONGLI. That's not to discredit ZHONGLI's role though. Having such a strong shield and super armor is a genuine benefit that can be an incalculable DPS increase. People tend to overlook the fact that not needing to dodge is time that can be allocated to attacks, and thus ZHONGLI is still a very good character in a ton of teams. And finally, I want to talk about ZHONGLI's personal damage. Is building ZHONGLI's damage worth it? I actually touched on this topic many months ago when I made a video on why I think the Black Tassel is not a good weapon for ZHONGLI. But the general gist is, while ZHONGLI's damage is not super high, once you get to higher levels of investment, you're going to want to build at least some damage even on supports, and thus by proxy, ZHONGLI. Additionally, ZHONGLI's best general weapon, the Favonius Lance, requires some amount of crit rate anyways, which means you still will want a build that mildly focuses on damage. So the summary is, yes, in a support role, I do believe you should always be building ZHONGLI as a sub or burst DPS. His damage multipliers are actually decent, and building him as a pure shield bot is just throwing away free damage for a mildly stronger shield that isn't even really necessary. At high levels of investment, ZHONGLI's damage can also be a good contributor to his team's DPS, though admittedly, it does take a lot of investment to reach that level with him. But what about a main DPS ZHONGLI? When people talk about a main DPS ZHONGLI, there are two ways to go about it. Either physical ZHONGLI with his normal attacks, or a geo damage ZHONGLI using his pillars and ult when paired with other damage buffing supports like GOMC or Goro. First, touching on physical ZHONGLI, I honestly think this is super whack. The damage output is quite unimpressive relative to the level of investment, and physical supports are not great either. I seriously dissuade anyone from building a physical ZHONGLI unless you are in the early game or really want to use ZHONGLI on field all the time. As a physical DPS, he can be an okay placeholder for new players until you get someone better. For Geo ZHONGLI, it's okay. In 12.1.1 of the current 4.0 Abyss, the ZHONGLI plus GOMC microwave team actually performed around the same as my Ito team, so it is decently competitive in certain situations. However, similar to physical ZHONGLI, the level of investment to get there is just too high, and so it's very hard to recommend him as a main DPS for Geo. Though the benefit of this is that a geo damage focused ZHONGLI build works in his sub DPS support role as well, so he is flexible enough to provide good damage even in other DPS teams. All in all though, ZHONGLI is very straightforward to play. You hold your E for a shield, swap to other characters in your rotation, then swap back to ZHONGLI to refresh the shield or burst if there's rotational downtime. And then you just repeat the process again. At higher levels of investment, you can build ZHONGLI with more and more damage, but his general playstyle does not change. It just happens to deal more damage while doing so. ZHONGLI has a relatively unexceptional normal attack string. It has 6 total hits and looks very flashy. His charge attack is also very cool, though not very good for damage. There is usually no reason to level this talent, though if you're one of the few physical ZHONGLI players, then this talent will be very important for you to level. If you do use his normal attacks on field, make sure to jump or dash cancel after N5 for his optimal combo. ZHONGLI's elemental skill is the main part of his kit, so let's go over it in extensive detail. Firstly, this skill has both a tap and hold version. Tapping the skill summons a pillar onto the field. The pillar stays on the field for 30 seconds and pulses every 2 seconds, dealing geo damage within a small square AoE. The damage scales off both ZHONGLI's attack stat as well as a small percentage of HP from his A4. The pillar is a physical construct and thus can be climbed or used to block enemy projectiles. However, in the same way, it can also be broken by enemies. The pillar will resonate with other geo constructs if they are within the square AoE. One thing to note is that the resonance damage dealt by the pillar snapshots, meaning its damage output is set at the point the pillar was cast based on ZHONGLI's current stats. If you want to deal good pillar damage, such as in something like a microwave team with GeoMC, you are going to want to give ZHONGLI buffs first before summoning your pillars, as the ticking damage really does add up over time. The energy generation of this pillar is quite poor though, with each pulse having a 50% chance of generating 1 geoparticle when it hits an enemy. So ZHONGLI alone is going to have a very hard time battering himself for his burst despite its low cost. One final important thing to note about the pillar is that each tick has standard ICD geo application. This can be a genuine issue in certain teams, as the 1U geo gauge applied by the pillar can remove certain element auras from enemies due to crystallize. If you want to prevent this, you're going to want to position his pillar away from nearby enemies first. In most teams though, this generally should not be an issue. The tap version of the skill has a cooldown of 4 seconds. Alright, now moving on to holding this skill. When held, ZHONGLI will create a jade shield around him that scales off his HP and increases according to your talent level. While holding his E, ZHONGLI has complete super armor, which means he cannot get staggered or interrupted. If there is no pillar on the field, one will be summoned. If there already is one on the field, then no pillar will be summoned unless you have C1, in which case you can have up to a maximum of 2 pillars. The shield scaling is actually very high, but its biggest perk is its insane uptime. At any constellation level, the shield has 100% uptime, lasting for 20 seconds while having a cooldown of only 12 seconds. Having such a strong shield allows you to tank most hits in the game without the need to dodge, depending on your max HP of course. We'll get to his HP thresholds when we discuss his artifacts and stats later. While the shield is active, any enemies that are nearby will have universal resistance reduction by 20% as stated here. You can tell that enemies have the resistance down indicated by the downwards facing arrows on them. This is especially good because universal resistance shred, especially for animal, geo, and physical, is exceedingly rare. While the damage increase is not huge or anything, extra damage is extra damage, and is always welcome considering ZHONGLI is already a flexible defensive option in many teams. Also, when you cast his shield, nearby geo gauges will be drained, which includes geo shields and constructs from enemies. This is sometimes useful when you do face those specific geo elemental enemies, but most of the time this is not super relevant. Holding his E will also break ores around him, which makes him a very good overworld mining character. However, as strong as ZHONGLI's shield is, it is not foolproof. There are some instances of damage in this game that can bypass shields, the most notable of which being corrosion from the Rift Wolves. These are things that ZHONGLI cannot deal with on his own, and against such enemies, he is a much less favorable pick in the team, since you might be better off running a healer instead. Still though, his shield can often trivialize a large portion of the content in the game, and thus is also the reason why ZHONGLI is touted for regularly making people worse at Genshin. In general, for most players, this talent should be your highest priority to level and crown. Moving on to his elemental burst. I'd first like to say that this is still the coolest burst animation in the game, and I never get sick of watching it. Now, when cast, Zhongli summons a meteor that does geo damage within a pretty big AoE and applies a unique status known as Petrification. At talent level 10 and above, and prior to Constellation 4, Petrification will last for 4 seconds. But Petrification does not apply to boss type enemies and will only apply to regular mobs. Now, the damage scaling of this burst is actually not bad, with a 900% multiplier at talent level 10, plus additional damage from his A4. It also has a very low cost of only 40 energy, the lowest in the game. But this burst does come with a few caveats. For one, it has one of the longest casting animations in the game at over 2 seconds. In certain teams that have very tight rotations with less downtime for Zhongli, this burst can be viewed as a DPS loss to cast sometimes. However, for teams that do have rotational downtime to spare, which is in most teams, then casting this burst is perfectly fine, especially since Petrification is quite handy in certain AoE scenarios. With high enough investment, his burst can also be strong enough to wipe out small waves of trash mobs on behalf of the team. I do recommend leveling this talent as it's just extra damage and increasing the duration of Petrification anyways. For passive talents, his A1 just increases shield strength each time the shield takes damage for up to a maximum of additional 25% shield strength. This applies even when Zhongli is not the one on the field. His A4 is the more impactful passive, increasing the damage of his entire kit, scaling off percentages of his HP as stated here. Note that the extra damage is additive and is always a fixed amount based on your stats. This passive also minimizes the differences between using an attack percent sans and an HP percent sans. So in general, even for DPS Zhonglis, you are still recommended to use an HP percent timepiece, as the damage differences are often small enough where it is not worth sacrificing your shield strength for it. Alright, Zhongli has quite a lot of weapons to go over. Because he's both a support and sub DPS, he's relatively flexible with his weapon options. I'll go over all the recommended ones in order of star rarity, then give a weapon ranking at the end for both his support and DPS playstyles. Kicking off the 5-star list, we have the Staff of Homer and the Engulfing Lightning. Both of these are relatively offensive-oriented weapons, increasing Zhongli's personal damage by quite a lot. The Staff of Homer is generally the most damaging option, and still offers a slight increase to his shield strength thanks to the additional 20% HP granted from the passive. However, the second part of this weapon's passive is relatively impractical for Zhongli, as you are unlikely to have him below 50% HP anyways, so you can generally ignore this. But this weapon's raw stats with crit damage, HP, and attack bonus are all well suited to Zhongli's kit. On the other hand, the Engulfing Lightning offers less damage than Staff of Homer, but with the right build, the difference is not actually that massive. If you have Zhongli at Constellation 2 and above, this weapon is also great because it allows you to burst almost every rotation, which grants you both your shield and extra damage plus Petrification uptime. If you play with a burst-focused Zhongli, paired with the Emblem of Severed Fate artifact set, I highly recommend this weapon. This is also my weapon of choice when I play in co-op mode, as it allows me to permanently grant my teammates a shield while still doing very good damage. Aside from these two 5-star weapons though, I have a bit of a harder time recommending the other ones, as they all have their issues. The other crit ones like J-Wing Spear and Scarlet Sands can work as pure stat sticks, but have impractical stack building mechanics. The Vortex Vanquisher is just an inferior J-Wing Spear, and the Skyward Spine is just an inferior Favonius Lance. I think everything except the Skyward Spine is fine to use for damage, so the only one I highly dissuade you from using is going to be the Spine. This is still IMO the worst 5-star weapon in the game, and has no practical purpose on Zhongli. On to the 4-star weapons. My favorite and strongest recommendation to everyone building a support-focused Zhongli is going to be the Favonius Lance. This gives some ER in its substat, but more importantly, grants the entire party some white particles that helps lower the entire team's energy recharge requirements slightly. For a support Zhongli, this offers the best utility for the party, though with this weapon, you will need to build some crit rate, as this passive cannot be procced when Zhongli is off field, so that's just something to keep in mind. For his other 4-star options, I generally do not recommend them very much over Favonius Lance, but since they are usually more offense oriented, they can be good alternatives if you don't have the Staff of Homer or Engulfing Lightning. Firstly, we have the Catch, which is basically a worse Engulfing Lightning. It actually has very respectable damage though when paired with Emblem, and is great for a burst-oriented Zhongli. It also offers crit rate with its passive, which makes stat building a bit easier. Next up, we have the Deathmatch. This is a paid weapon from the Battle Pass and gives a ton of crit rate that makes stat building really easy, but does not offer much utility outside of that. This weapon is also very expensive to refine. Aside from these, there are a few notable weapons, but I generally don't recommend them. Lithic Spear is okay, but is very team comp and refinement dependent. Crescent Pike is usable for those physical Zhongli players out there. And Rightful Reward gives HP in its substat, but its passive is pretty unreliable to activate since Zhongli rarely will take damage anyways. And lastly, I know I have to bring this weapon up even though I hate it, but the Black Tassel is a low investment 3-star option that gives a ton of HP in its substat. I made a whole video on why I think this weapon sucks on ZHONGLI many months ago, but basically this weapon offers a mildly stronger shield that's often not even necessary while having no other good qualities that support the team. It being a 3-star weapon also means that its base stats are awful, and the passive is also useless. If you are new or don't have a Favonius Lance yet, then this weapon is usable, but I strongly advise against using this weapon once you've progressed a decent amount. If you need a 50,000 HP ZHONGLI shield to feel comfortable playing the game, then I'm really sorry to break it to you, but you just suck at playing the game and are just throwing away free damage for a shield you don't even need. Not to mention the poor returns on investing in a 3-star weapon. So yeah, to sum it up, here are my weapon rankings for ZHONGLI. For those playing support ZHONGLI, Favonius Lance is really just the way to go. It offers the best team utility that is meaningful at any level of play, then any other options are just good if you want damage. For those who really want to focus on ZHONGLI's geo damage, the 5-star weapons are generally going to reign supreme just due to their raw stats. Catch and Deathmatch are actually usually not too far behind, depending on the build. I do not recommend Black Tassel for either build if you have any of the weapons in the ranking. For ZHONGLI stats, there are usually a few things to pay attention to when building ZHONGLI. His two main important stats to look out for are his HP and his crit. I'll also just get out of the way first. Energy recharge is nice to have on ZHONGLI, but in a support role, it is generally not very important. If you want to burst every rotation solo, it's going to be nearly impossible unless you have like over 170%, and that usually equates to using Emblem of Severed Fate plus an ER weapon. So most of the time, I would say just don't fret about energy recharge. So how much HP do you need for ZHONGLI? This will vary a lot based on the build type, but these are my general thresholds for HP. For those using a Geo Goblet like me, you should try to have over 30,000 HP for a decent enough shield. You won't be able to tank everything and minimal dodging is still sometimes needed, but you should still be very comfortable and should only have your shield broken against certain bosses. For those of you using an HP % goblet, it should be relatively easy to hit around 35 to over 40,000 HP. With this much HP, you should be able to tank basically everything without a care, though obviously some exceptions do still apply. For the most part, I recommend trying to dodge wherever possible just to minimize the damage that the shield takes, and also just cause dodging is a good skill to have. For his actual artifact main stats, his Sands should almost always be HP %, his Goblet can be HP % or geo damage depending on whether you want a stronger shield or more damage, and his Circlet should always be crit. Don't look at this and think HP % is optimal. Crit should always be your way to go. Similar to what I said in the weapons section, going full HP is such a waste of free damage that it's just not worth it. If you use Favonius Lance, you're going to need the crit rate anyways. But how much crit do you actually need? Now, because ZHONGLI is a support, my recommended artifact standards are a bit lower. I would say if you can hit at least 60% crit rate with around 110 to 120% crit damage without a crit weapon, you are pretty set. This amounts to around 170 to 180% crit value in artifacts alone, which is pretty low and is easy to achieve with just a bit of farming. If you are building ZHONGLI with a heavier focus on DPS, then obviously you need to readjust your artifact standards to be higher. My own personal ZHONGLI has a crit ratio of 71% crit rate to 225% crit damage with the Staff of Homer, which amounts to 243 crit value in artifacts alone. This is obviously artifact quality that's going to be very difficult to achieve for the majority of players, but you can just take this as a point of reference. For ZHONGLI's recommended sets, he has many different options depending on whether you want more support potential or more damage, and thus is relatively flexible in his choices. The first and most general option I will recommend is the 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith. This set gives ZHONGLI more HP while providing a decent attack bonus to the entire party. The 4-piece bonus can be procced off field and thus synergizes with ZHONGLI's pillar ticks. This set is great for the majority of ZHONGLI players. The alternative to 4-piece Tenacity is 4-piece Noblesse Oblige. This set functions very similarly, but the biggest issue is that it requires ZHONGLI to cast his burst to proc. ZHONGLI's energy generation is quite poor and may not be able to cast his burst every rotation, which makes this generally an inferior set to Tenacity. Those two sets are what I consider to be best for ZHONGLI as a support. But if you want more damage for ZHONGLI, here are the DPS focused sets. First up, we have 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate. This gives ZHONGLI a bit of ER while increasing his burst damage by a good amount. But with this set, ZHONGLI's pillar and E damage will be quite weak. This set is honestly surprisingly good for ZHONGLI, especially if you play him with the Catch or Engulfing Lightning. Then we have the 2-piece sets. Any combination of the following sets will work just fine. 2-piece Archaic Petra will increase ZHONGLI's damage on all fronts, then 2-piece Noblesse or any of the 2-piece attack sets are good to pair with it. I personally use the 2-piece Archaic Petra plus 2-piece Shimenawas, which is good for general geo damage on his pillar and burst, but also because this just has my best artifact quality. Any combination of these 3 sets will work just fine. Lastly, for the miscellaneous sets, 4-piece Archaic Petra is a usable support option, but this set is quite annoying to play with, as you need Zhongli to be the one to trigger the Crystallize, and also be the one to pick up the Shard for the damage bonus. This will not work in all teams or scenarios, and it's generally just kind of annoying to play around, so I do not like the set at all. And then lastly, for the 3 physical gamers out there, the 4-piece Pale Flame, Gladiator's Finale, Echoes of an Offering, and Shimenawa's Reminiscence are all fine for a normal attack focused Zhongli. Alright, team comps. Zhongli is a very flexible teammate due to Geo being a relatively neutral element and shielding being useful for quite a few characters, but he does have a few notable teams that he performs better in. Firstly, any character who really does not like getting interrupted or does not have super armor is going to heavily benefit from having Zhongli. Charge shot or fast normal attackers like Ganyu, Yoimiya, and Tignari are pretty good examples of this, where getting interrupted can actually be a pretty big DPS loss, and it's here where Zhongli's role as a strong shielder really shines. Another example of a character who really likes Zhongli is Wanderer. Wanderer is very easy to knock out of the air and takes a long time to recover in flight, so Zhongli's shield negates all of that interruption during his rotation time. Another big beneficiary of Zhongli, arguably the biggest one, is going to be Hu Tao. Hu Tao needs to stay under 50% HP, but also doesn't want to die while doing so, and so Zhongli's shield fixes that issue while also letting her do charge attacks without getting interrupted. Then we have the Geo teams. Any Geo-focused team, whether you are playing Ito, Ningguang, or Geo Traveler, will all benefit from having Zhongli. The resistance shred from his shield, plus the actual shield itself, plus Geo Resonance all add up quite a bit. And while Zhongli's role doesn't really change, it's more amplified in these teams where he can offer more damage and support. I'd also like to bring focus to the Geo Traveler team, or also known as the Microwave team. In this team, you focus on using Zhongli's pillars with Geo MC's Boulders and Burst to do continuous ticking damage against enemies inside this chamber. This team is actually surprisingly good at high investment and against certain content in the game. For example, in the current Abyss 12-1-1, this team was very competitive and was only barely slower than my Ito team. Of course, this team does not work everywhere, but it's still quite a fun team to play when it works. But yeah, the Big Dong Zhong is incredibly flexible. Despite Geo being in a bad spot right now, it doesn't really affect Zhongli, as him being a neutral yet strong defensive option is his greatest strength. However, I'd also like to emphasize that as a defensive character, he is almost never the best option for damage amplification. Zhongli is first and foremost a comfort pick, allowing you to get through most content in the game with ease, but not necessarily quickly. Once you get to higher levels of play, I'd say Zhongli's usefulness definitely diminishes for a lot of teams. That said though, his universal resistance shred, incredible damage mitigation, as well as most reliable external source of super armor still makes him one of the best characters in the game for overall flexibility and support potential. Even to this day, I use him a lot both in the overworld and in the Abyss. He is a fantastic teammate that is pretty hard to go wrong with. Zhongli has some good, albeit not very impactful constellations. They all serve to improve his quality of life gameplay, which is naturally very welcome as a support character. Constellation 1. This gives one extra pillar to Zhongli when you use his tap or hold E. This is both a pro and a con. The pro is that more pillars mean more damage, as well as slightly higher energy generation. If you have a well-built Zhongli, the extra pillar damage can be quite significant. But at the same time, the pillar's weaknesses are also amplified when you have more of them. For one, this makes working with freeze teams slightly more annoying, since the pillar can shatter frozen enemies. Secondly, it's also a physical hindrance in combat, as the chances of you accidentally climbing them are higher. Personally, I find this constellation relatively useless for most people, but if you intend to build a DPS Zhongli or play in certain Geo teams specifically, then this constellation is fine. Constellation 2. This grants Zhongli a shield when he uses his burst and thus serves two main purposes. Firstly, it makes Zhongli's burst much more meaningful, since you are now more incentivized to build burst damage for Zhongli. Secondly, this allows you to cut out his hold E from at least the very first rotation, which prevents the previously mentioned pillar problems, while also cutting Zhongli's rotation down slightly. This constellation also allows you to grant all party members a shield in co-op, which is helpful, I guess, if you play in co-op often. If you happen to build a DPS Zhongli with a Geo Goblet, then your shield is obviously not going to be as strong as with an HP Goblet, but this constellation helps with your shield uptime since you still retain your hold E to gain a shield even after it breaks. Personally, I think this is Zhongli's best constellation. It cuts his rotation time down and makes his burst more meaningful. If you have this constellation, I highly recommend using a Geo Goblet in your build for more damage, since you will now actually want to cast his burst and thus increase his DPS. For those of you who want to pull for ZHONGLI constellations, this is the best stopping point. Constellation 3 and 5 are pretty normal talent increases, but C3 in particular increases the shield scaling, which is pretty good. Constellation 4. This increases the AoE of ZHONGLI's Meteor while also extending the duration of Petrification. Personally, I've never had an issue with this burst AoE, so I find the first part of this constellation kinda useless, but the Petrification duration increase is actually quite good against non-boss type enemies. This constellation is really just a small quality of life upgrade though. Constellation 6. This is ZHONGLI's most interesting constellation, I would say. This turns his role into a shielder and a minor healer, as any incoming damage taken from the shield will heal the on-field character up to a maximum percentage as stated here. In general, due to ZHONGLI's already strong shield, healing is usually unnecessary, but you can just treat this as a safety net if your shield does break, which is still very possible in the Spiral Abyss, though not so much in the overworld. The healing effect also works in co-op as well if you granted your party members a shield. While this constellation sounds very strong, because it kind of is, it's also not like super helpful even in the Abyss. Even with my 32,000 HP ZHONGLI, I've never felt like his shield was not strong enough, except maybe in 3.7's Abyss with the Constipated Beast. The best use case of this constellation is when you fight against enemies who can do true damage through shields, such as Corrosion from the Rift Wolves. While the Corrosion can bypass shields, the hits that apply it will still provide healing. So while it won't completely save you, since Corrosion does eat your HP faster than the shield can heal, it just makes it slightly easier when dealing with such true damage instances. I think this constellation is good, but it's far from necessary. It also has slight anti-synergy when playing with Hu Tao, so just if that's important to you, just keep that in mind. So overall, ZHONGLI has some pretty decent constellations, albeit nothing amazing. I'd say if you were a low spender, I still don't recommend pulling anything beyond C0. But if you wanted the most impactful constellation, C2 is about as far as I would go. Then if you wanted anything else beyond that, you should just be willing to go all the way for C6. Finally, onto the Abyss Showcase. I'll be using ZHONGLI in 3 different teams on the top half of Abyss 12. Please enjoy the showcase.
稲光すなわち永遠なりヒュッ裁きの雷知
識はあなたに
天道万象文庫
Thank you for watching this ZHONGLI guide. I worked really hard on this one and it took a very long time to get all of this information together. I hope it was useful and I wish everyone the best of luck building him. Please check out twitch.tv/GKC as well, where I often stream Genshin Impact. Thanks once again for watching and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.